My name is Kate Harper, 27 years old, a former Army Staff Sergeant and combat medic. Right now, I'm standing in a white lace wedding dress that's rubbing against skin still scarred from a war that didn't involve bullets. In the middle of my wedding reception, my own mother, dressed in head-to-toe black as if she's attending a funeral, marched up and snatched the microphone from the DJ's hand. 150 guests went dead silent. She pointed a bright red fingernail at my husband, Cole, a combat engineer veteran who just got back from 2 deployments, and screamed into the speakers, "This gold digger only married her for our house." While her voice was still ringing through the hall, my sister slid a thick legal folder across the table, slamming it into my dinner plate. The bold heading read, "Waiver of Property Ownership." They were trying to hijack $85,000 I'd bled for just to save their roof, using my own wedding day to put a gun to my ribs. But they didn't know about the black USB drive sitting in my husband's pocket. Before I show you how the truth blew that hall apart, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Click like and subscribe if you've ever realized that the deepest stabs always come from those who share your blood. It started on a Tuesday night. My phone didn't just ring. It screamed, vibrating against the nightstand with an urgency I'd only ever felt in a trauma bay. It was my mother, Janet. She wasn't just crying, she was hyperventilating, her voice a jagged, wet rasp through the receiver. "The foundation is buckling, Kate. The roof is gone. The rain is pouring onto the kitchen floor. We're going to lose the house." I hung up and checked the family group chat, my heart hammering against my ribs. A message from my younger sister, Brielle, popped up immediately. "I'm fully booked this week with pageant dress fittings. You two call a contractor yourself." Typical Brielle. The golden child was too busy chasing a plastic crown to care about the walls rotting around our parents' ears. I didn't pause to think. I just went into mission mode. I tossed my uniform onto the bed, grabbed my keys, and drove 300 miles through the black Tennessee night to Macon Hills. When I walked through the door, the smell of damp drywall and old mildew hit me like a physical blow. My mother was slumped at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. My father, Bobby, just stood there in the corner, staring at the water dripping onto the linoleum with a hollow, useless look in his eyes. Neither of them had called a bank. Neither of them had contacted a contractor. They hadn't done a single thing. They were just waiting. They were waiting for me. Thursday morning felt colder than the desert ever did. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the local bank, the air conditioning biting at the back of my neck. The teller didn't look me in the eye when he slid the cashier's check across the counter toward me. $85,000. I stared at the numbers until they blurred into a smudge of black ink. That wasn't just money. That was 10 years of my life. That was the hazard pay I'd earned while mortars shook the ground beneath my boots. That was the compensation for the ligaments I'd snapped while hauling wounded soldiers into transport choppers in the Middle East. It was every night I'd woken up screaming from the sound of flares. And now, it was being liquidated into concrete, rafters, and copper pipes for a house I didn't even live in anymore. I pressed the ballpoint pen down hard, the blue ink carving into the paper with a scratchy final sound. My youth, my blood, my peace of mind. All signed away in a single, desperate stroke. For the next 3 months, I didn't stay in my old bedroom. I didn't belong there anymore. I camped in the front yard. I lived out of the back of my bruised Chevy truck, sitting on the hood as the humid Tennessee summer clung to my skin like a wet blanket. Dinner was a cold pouch of Army surplus MRE beef stew. I'd tear the silver foil pack, that sharp, metallic zip echoing in the quiet of the yard, and eat it cold, the congealed grease coating the roof of my mouth. I chewed slowly, my eyes locked on the roofing crew, making sure not a single shingle was wasted and not a single dime of my money was stolen by lazy work. Brielle swung by exactly once. She pulled her convertible into the muddy driveway, the engine purring like a satisfied cat. She didn't even bother to get out of the car. She just stepped one high-heeled foot onto the running board, avoided a mud puddle with a look of pure disgust, and snapped a selfie with the scaffolding in the background. She probably captioned it about family trials before she floored the gas. leaving me in a cloud of dust and the expensive scent of her perfume. The day the job was finally finished, the scent of fresh white paint almost covered the stench of the past. My mother walked out onto the porch, the new wood creaking under her feet. She reached out and touched my shoulder, a light, fleeting brush that felt more like a polite gesture to a stranger than a mother's embrace. "This house is yours, Kate," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the new siding. "When we're gone, everything we have belongs to you." My father stood behind her, nodding as he cracked open a can of Pop's Blue Ribbon. The clink hiss of the tab was the only confirmation I got. There was no lawyer, there was no notary, there was no signed contract. I looked them in the eyes and I nodded back. In the field, your teammate's word is your lifeline. You don't ask for a signed affidavit when someone says they've got your six while you're patching a bleeder in the mud. I was stupid enough to bring that rule home to Macon Hills. I was stupid enough to believe that blood was the ultimate contract, a bond that didn't need a witness. I didn't realize that as soon as that ink on the check dried, my value in that house evaporated. I had paid for the walls, but I was about to find out that I wasn't allowed to exist within them. 6 months had passed since the day I signed away $85,000 of my life savings, yet the air in Macon Hills still felt heavy with the scent of unkept promises. I pulled my truck into the driveway of the house I had saved, intending only to grab my reserve uniform for the upcoming drill weekend. The house looked beautiful from the outside: fresh siding, a sturdy roof, clear windows, all the things my 10 years of service had paid for. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, the warmth of the afternoon sun died. I stopped dead in front of the refrigerator. This appliance, which I had bought with my own hazard pay, had been transformed into a sprawling, gilded shrine for my younger sister. Every square inch of the stainless steel was plastered with glossed photos of Brielle, her crowning moment as junior miss, her pageant sashes, and endless selfies of her smiling, inexpensive gowns. My eyes searched for the one thing I had left there. A month ago, I had pinned my Army Commendation Medal to the freezer door with a simple magnet, a quiet reminder that I existed too. It was gone. I began opening drawers, my chest tightening with a familiar, hollow dread. Finally, I found it. My medal was shoved into the very back of the junk drawer, buried under a tangled mess of leaky AA batteries, dried-out pens, and oily kitchen rags. The bronze star was smudged with grease, discarded like a piece of worthless scrap metal. It was my first realization that in this house, my service was just clutter to be cleared away. I didn't say a word. I just gripped the medal in my palm, the cold metal biting into my skin, and walked toward the stairs. I needed my uniform. I needed to get out of there. But when I reached the second floor and turned the knob to my old bedroom, the door swung open to reveal a sight that hit me harder than a flashbang. The room was unrecognizable. My twin bed was gone. The unit flag I'd proudly hung over the headboard had been stripped away. In their place sat a thin, seafoam green yoga mat and a massive, full-length mirror. The walls, which had once been a neutral beige, were now covered in a loud, suffocating coat of lavender purple. The air was thick and sickly sweet, with the smell of cheap eucalyptus essential oil, the scent Brielle used to mask everything. There wasn't a single trace of me left. It wasn't just a renovation, it was an eviction of my soul. They hadn't just moved my things, they had painted over my history. A desperate instinct drove me down to the garage. I punched the light switch, the flickering fluorescent bulb illuminating the dark corners where the family junk was kept. There, pushed against a stack of rusted lawnmower parts and old tires, were 2 translucent plastic tubs. I ripped the lid off the first one. My entire life had been shoved inside like trash. My dog tags were tangled in a pair of worn-out fatigues. My service boots were thrown in lopsidedly, covered in dust. And then, at the very bottom, I saw it. The wool field blanket I had brought home from Kabul. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling as I touched the rough fabric. There was a dark, faded stain on one corner, the blood of a brother I couldn't save during a roadside ambush. This blanket was the most sacred thing I owned, a piece of my heart that still beat for the fallen. And they had balled it up and tossed it into a plastic bin next to a bag of potting soil. They didn't see a soldier's sacrifice. They saw a nuisance that took up too much space. I walked back into the living room, my hands hanging limp at my sides, still clutching that dusty blanket. My mother was sitting in her favorite armchair, lazily flipping through a fashion magazine as if it were just another quiet Tuesday afternoon. She took a slow sip of her tea, the porcelain clicking against her teeth, and didn't even bother to look up at me. "Brielle needed a space for her yoga, Kate," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any remorse. "You don't really live here anymore anyway. It's better this way." Her indifference was a blade, sharp and clinical. It was the sound of a mother who had stopped seeing her daughter as a human being and started seeing her as a bank account. I turned my head to see my father, Bobby, sitting on the sofa watching a game. He saw me standing there, red-eyed and shaking with a silent fury, and he didn't say a word. He just stood up, gripped his black coffee cup, and slipped through the back door into the garden without making eye contact. He was the great avoider, a man who would rather let his daughter's identity be erased than have an uncomfortable conversation with his wife. I stood there, a ghost in the house I had built, realizing the most painful truth of my life. I had bought these walls, but I was the only thing not allowed to exist inside them. I know there are many of you listening who have felt like a glass child, invisible in your own family, while the golden child gets all the light. If you have ever felt like you were just a tool to be used and then discarded, please support this story by hitting the like button. I want to know I'm not alone in this. Comment the words, "I see you," below if you've ever had your own history erased by the people who were supposed to cherish it. Your comments are the fuel that keeps this story going. I looked at the lavender walls one last time, the smell of eucalyptus making my stomach turn. For years, I had told myself that if I just did enough, if I just gave enough, they would finally look at me and see a daughter worth loving. I had traded 10 years of my youth and $85,000 for a lie. My value wasn't in my service or my character, it was in my ability to pay for their comfort. I was a phantom, a walking ATM with a pulse. But as I walked toward the front door, the weight of the cobble blanket in my arms felt different. It wasn't just a memory of the past anymore. It was a reminder of who I actually was. I was a survivor, and I was done being invisible. I had to find someone who could see the person behind the uniform, because I couldn't survive another night in this purple-painted tomb. I had to ask myself, what do I have to do to make them see me? The air in Macon Hills doesn't just hang. It clings like a wet woolen blanket, heavy with the scent of pine and stagnant resentment. It was exactly 2 months after I had spent $85,000 of my hard-earned combat pay to keep my parents' roof from collapsing when the first real gutter failed. I wasn't surprised. I had learned early on that even a brand new roof couldn't fix a foundation that had been rotting for decades. I called a local contractor, expecting some fast-talking salesman in a shiny SUV. Instead, a bruised tan Ford F-150 pulled into the gravel driveway, its engine letting out a low, guttural growl that felt more honest than anything I'd heard since I left the service. Cole Reston stepped out of the cab with the deliberate movements of a man who knew exactly how much weight his joints could carry. He wore jeans stained with dried cement and a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were carved from Tennessee hickory. His hands were thick and calloused, etched with the small nicks and white scars of a man who actually built things instead of just talking about them. We didn't need a long introduction. Within 3 sentences, I caught the rhythmic cadence of his speech and the way he locked his shoulders. I recognized his military occupational specialty immediately, a former combat engineer. He didn't boast or try to upsell me on a drainage system I didn't need. He just grabbed a ladder, pulled a cordless drill from his belt, and reset the entire line of screws in 15 minutes. Between us, there was an immediate, silent magnetism, the kind only survivors of the same type of war ever feel. He was my anchor, the first person in this town who didn't look at me like a bank account. 2 months later, I made the mistake of bringing Cole home for a Friday night dinner. I wanted them to see him, to see the man who was finally standing by my side without an ulterior motive. But as soon as we walked through the front door, the atmosphere shifted into something sharp and clinical. My mother, Janet, looked at Cole's dusty work boots, and I saw her upper lip twitch in a tiny, involuntary spasm of disgust. She pulled out the kitchen chairs, and with a flick of her wrist, she slid a paper plate, thin, flimsy, and already soaking up grease, toward Cole. On it was a single charred piece of brisket and a scoop of store-bought potato salad. At the other end of the table, the contrast was a physical weight in the room. Brielle's boyfriend Travis, a real estate broker who wore a tailored navy vest and smelled of expensive, overbearing cologne, was served on gold-rimmed French porcelain taken straight from the locked china cabinet. My mother treated Travis like royalty, while she treated Cole like a common intruder who had wandered in from the job site. Cole didn't flinch. He didn't ask for a real fork or a porcelain plate. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a black multi-tool, and used the sharp blade to cut his meat. He chewed in silence, his eyes calm and observant, radiating a quiet power that made the porcelain and the silk vests look like cheap props in a mediocre play. This was the classism I'd grown up with. The golden child and her white-collar trophies versus the glass child and her blue-collar reality. After the meal, I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of ice water, my chest tightening with a simmering, familiar heat. Through the thin drywall of the pantry, I heard it, the sound that always signaled a new wound. Brielle's voice was a high, jagged rasp, followed by my mother's soft, poison-laced chuckle. "What is wrong with her?" Brielle hissed, her tone dripping with condescension. "Dating a construction guy with a beat-up truck? I guess no decent man would ever look at someone as rugged and homely as Kate." I gripped the handle of my glass so hard my knuckles turned a ghostly white, the glass groaning under the pressure. They were using their shallow, borrowed yardsticks to measure the only man who had ever truly seen my worth. They were judging my choice, trying to make me feel small for loving someone who actually knew the value of a hard day's work. I didn't stay for dessert. I walked straight out the front door, the screen slamming behind me with a finality that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Cole was already in his F-150, the engine idling in the darkness of the driveway. I climbed into the passenger seat, my breath coming in short, jagged bursts of adrenaline and hurt. Cole reached out, his scarred arm resting across the back of the bench seat. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. He reached over and turned off the ignition, letting the heavy silence of the Tennessee night settle between us. "You don't have to force a smile for me, Kate," he said, his voice deep and steady as a mountain. I looked at him, the dashboard lights catching the hard, honest lines of his face. "They judge me by the truck I drive," he continued, a cold military edge entering his tone. "But I judge them by the rotten, leaky foundation of a house that you had to bleed $85,000 of your own money to save." For the first time in my 27 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I wasn't just a bank account or a soldier who existed only to serve their needs. I was a woman worth protecting. But as we sat there in the cab of that Ford, I realized that Cole's presence had done more than just give me a home. It had sounded a battle alarm for the vultures inside that house. Brielle's scathing words weren't just insults. They were the beginning of a campaign. I could see the vultures circling, ready to tear down the only good thing I had left to protect their own greed. The war wasn't over. It was just moving from the desert to the front yard. I had finally found my ally, and I knew that from this moment on, every word said behind my back was a stone being gathered for a riot. I wasn't alone anymore, and that was exactly what my family feared most. Sunday morning in Macon Hills usually smells like damp earth and old pine, but that day, sitting in the cab of Cole's Ford F-150 by the edge of the lake, the air felt thick and electric. The water was a sheet of gray glass, reflecting a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or just let the humidity suffocate us. Cole parked the truck, the engine cooling with a rhythmic, metallic ticking that seemed to match the frantic beating of my heart. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached into the pocket of his heavy work vest and pulled out a small worn box. Inside was a ring, a raw, heavy steel band with a dark, unpolished stone. It wasn't the kind of delicate, sparkling jewelry Brielle would flaunt to the town, but it was honest. It was strong. "I want to build something real with you, Kate," he said, his voice deep and grounding like the earth itself. "Not just drywall and rafters, but a life where you don't have to fight every battle alone and where your sacrifice actually means something." I let him slide the band onto my ring finger. the cold metal rubbing against my skin with a weight that felt like a shield. For a few precious minutes, the world was quiet. I let myself believe that I was finally moving toward a shore where I wouldn't have to drown in my family's endless, suffocating expectations. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed my mother's number. I wanted her to be the first to know. Even after everything, some small pathetic part of me still wanted her to be happy for me. I wanted to hear a flicker of joy, a momentary lapse in her usual clinical coldness. The line hissed with static, 5 long, hollow rings echoing in my ear before she finally picked up. I took a shallow breath and told her that Cole had asked me to marry him. There was a silence on the other end that lasted 2 agonizing seconds. "Well, that was fast," Janet finally said, her tone as flat and lifeless as a grave marker. I felt the air leave my lungs. "I have to go, Kate. Brielle just tripped on the porch and broke one of her new acrylic nails. She's in a total state." Then came the sound, the long, empty monotone of the dial tone, cutting me off before I could even say a word of goodbye. I stared at the screen as the line went dead, the silence ringing in my ears like a physical blow. 1 week later, the first wave of the real assault hit. Brielle didn't confront me. She did something much more calculated. She went to the town post office, the nerve center of Macon Hill's gossip, and put on a masterclass in manipulation. She leaned over the counter, dabbing at fake tears while she talked to Ms. Darla. She whispered about how Cole was isolating me, using psychological tactics to turn me against my own flesh and blood so he could get his hands on the house I had just spent $85,000 to repair. By Friday afternoon, the smear campaign had turned the town into a minefield. When I walked into the local grocery store, the whispers followed me like a cold draft. People I'd known since I was a child looked at me with a mixture of pity and judgment. Everyone was talking about the gold digger contractor and the naive soldier he was tricking. They didn't offer help. They just wrapped their malice in fake Southern hospitality, telling me they were praying for the Harper family, while they looked at Cole's truck as if it were a getaway vehicle. The phone rang at 8 o'clock that evening. It was Janet. I slid the button to answer, and her voice dropped onto me like a slab of wet concrete. "Your father and I have made a final decision," she said, skipping any pretense of a greeting. "You have Cole now. He's a contractor. He can provide for you. We've decided the house is going to Brielle. She's struggling with her apartment rent, and it's only fair she has a place to call her own." I felt the blood rush to my face, a hot, throbbing pressure behind my eyes. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table so hard the wood groaned, the green veins on the back of my hand bulging under the skin. "Mom, you can't be serious," I choked out, my voice thick with disbelief. "I put $85,000 into those walls. That was 10 years of my life. That was my hazard pay from the desert. That was my blood." "Don't you dare try to use money to pressure your own mother," she snapped back, her voice rising to a high, jagged pitch that pierced through my last layer of defense. "Ever since you met that Cole, you've become so calculating, counting every penny you give your own family. You should be ashamed of yourself." The line went dead again. Desperate for a voice of reason, I dialed my father's number. Bobby picked up, but in the background, I could hear the mindless, booming roar of a baseball game on the television. "Dad, you have to say something," I yelled into the receiver, my voice cracking with a decade's worth of suppressed pain. "You were there. You heard the promises she made on the porch." There was a long, cowardly silence on the other end, punctuated only by the distant crack of a bat on the TV. "Just drop it, Kate," he finally mumbled, his voice small and hollow. "Your mother's mind is made up. There's nothing I can do." He disconnected the call before I could utter another word. I stood in the center of my kitchen, the absolute silence of the room pressing against my eardrums like the bottom of the ocean. $85,000 gone into a house I didn't own. No legal contract to protect me. And finally, I realized I had no family left to call. I stood there alone, the heavy steel ring on my finger, the only thing keeping me from floating away into the dark. I had given them everything, and in return, they had erased me. I looked at the phone, waiting for a miracle, but all I got was the hum of the refrigerator. I knew then that the next time they reached out, it wouldn't be with words, it would be with paper. 14 days before my wedding, the first true legal bullet was fired. The knock on my door was sharp, a series of quick, impatient raps that sounded exactly like my sister. When I opened it, Brielle was standing there, her face partially obscured by oversized designer sunglasses that cost more than my first truck. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me and slapped a stapled document onto my kitchen table. The friction of the heavy bond paper against the wood made a sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The heading was in bold, clinical black ink. Gift confirmation letter. Brielle didn't take off her glasses. She just tilted her head, her chin pointed at the page like a weapon. "It's just a formality, Kate," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "Mom wants to be sure before the wedding. She needs you to confirm that the $85,000 you put into the house was a non-refundable gift." I looked at the paper, then back at her. $85,000. 10 years of sand, sweat, and the smell of copper in a trauma bay, all reduced to a gift so I could be legally erased from my own sacrifice. I shoved the paper back toward her with a slow, deliberate movement. "I'm not signing this," I said. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brielle snatched her sunglasses off, her eyes flashing with a predatory greed I had never seen so clearly. She didn't argue. She just glared at me for 5 long seconds before spinning on her heel and storming out. The door hadn't even finished vibrating when Cole stepped out from the hallway. He didn't say a word. He just pulled his phone from his pocket and took a high-resolution photo of the document she had left behind. His face was a mask of tactical focus, his movements efficient and cold. 3 days later, I drove back to the old house in Macon Hills at high noon. I told myself I was just there to grab my last pair of combat boots from the garage. The neighborhood was quiet, the heavy Tennessee heat shimmering off the asphalt. My parents' cars were gone. They were likely at one of my mother's church committee meetings. I used my old remote to crack the garage door just enough to slide through, the motor groaning in the silence. I stepped into the shadows of the garage, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and the dust of my discarded life. I moved like I was back on a night patrol, silent, eyes scanning, breath shallow. I was halfway to the bin containing my boots when a voice drifted down from the second floor. It was Brielle. She was in her new lavender-painted room, and her phone was on speaker. The sound of a FaceTime call echoed through the vents, amplified by the hollow walls. I froze. My hand went instinctively to my pocket, pulling out my phone and hitting the record button before I even realized I was doing it. "The old folks are so easy to play," Brielle's voice rang out, followed by a sharp, jagged laugh. I just threw them that line about Cole only loving Kate for the house, and they swallowed it whole. I heard Travis's low, oily chuckle on the other end of the line. Then Brielle delivered the kill shot, her voice dripping with a casual, terrifying contempt. "As soon as they sign the deed over to me, I'm putting it on the market. I've already talked to the flippers. $450,000. Easy. Kate is such a fool for dumping $85,000 into a house she's never going to own a piece of." The blood in my veins didn't just run cold, it turned to ice. I stood there in the dark, surrounded by my boxed-up memories, listening to my sister calculate the price of my soul. I waited until the line went dead. Then I backed out of the garage, my boots forgotten, and hit the save button on the recording. When I got home that night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked into the living room and tossed my phone onto the table where Cole was sitting. I waited for him to break a glass or curse the heavens. But Cole Reston was a combat engineer. He didn't react to explosions, he cleared them. He listened to the recording twice, his jaw set in a hard, straight line. Without a word, he stood up and pulled a heavy brown folder from his backpack. He sat down at his laptop. The click-click of the mouse, the only sound in our quiet apartment. He uploaded the recording, then added the photos of my bank statements, the invoices from the roofers, and the picture of the gift letter Brielle had tried to force on me. "They're setting up an ambush for the wedding," Cole said, his voice as steady as a heart monitor. He reached over and picked up a small matte black USB drive, sliding it into the port with a final, metallic snick. "But they've forgotten one thing about engineers, Kate. We don't just build things. We know exactly how to lay a minefield." He looked at me then, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. "We don't say a word. he whispered. We let them walk right into the middle of the kill zone. We let them think they've won until the very second the truth goes live. I looked at that little black drive sitting on the table, a silent digital bomb waiting for its moment. The fear that had been gnawing at my gut for weeks finally died. It was replaced by a cold, clinical focus. The Harpers wanted a war? Fine, I was a soldier, and I was finally bringing the battle to their front door. June 14th in Tennessee usually brings a thick, heavy heat that clings to the skin, but inside the restored oak barn where I was supposed to be celebrating my new life, the air felt like the interior of a meat locker. The venue was a rustic masterpiece of cedar beams and string lights that glowed like fallen stars against the dark wood. My fellow combat medics and army comrades stood tall in their dress blues, their medals glinting sharply under the rafters. A sea of honor, discipline, and shared history. Everything was perfect. A brief moment of peace I thought I had finally earned until the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall creaked open. The Harper family didn't just enter, they invaded. My mother, Janet, my father, Bobby, my sister, Brielle, and her boyfriend, Travis, marched down the center aisle in a single, grim line. They weren't wearing the festive pastels or the light linens we had requested for the summer wedding. Instead, they were draped in head-to-toe, charcoal black. From Janet's heavy mourning veil to Brielle's tight lace cocktail dress, they looked like a funeral procession for a life I hadn't even started yet. 150 guests went stone silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, aggressive thud-clack of Brielle's designer heels striking the polished wood floor. They didn't bring flowers. They didn't bring smiles. They walked past the rows of chairs like an execution squad, their eyes fixed forward, ignoring the confused and uncomfortable whispers of my friends. Janet caught my eye from the back row, her gaze as cold and lifeless as a winter grave. When the time came for our vows, Cole took my hands in his. His grip was a grounding force, a raw heat that burned through my lace gloves and told me he wasn't going anywhere, no matter what kind of storm was brewing in the pews. He didn't look at the black-clad vultures sitting in the front row. He locked his eyes onto mine, his voice steady and echoing through the high rafters of the barn. I will always protect what is ours, Kate, he said, the words sounding less like a romantic promise and more like a tactical oath sworn in the mud. I will stand between you and any threat, even when the enemy is standing right inside our own house. I saw Brielle's lip curl in a visible sneer as she crossed her arms, while my father, Bobby, stared down at his scuffed loafers, unable to meet my eyes even as I pledged my life to the man standing beside me. The reception started under a cloud of suffocating tension that no amount of champagne could thin out. We had barely finished our first dance when the upbeat country music was suddenly cut short, replaced by a deafening, ringing silence. My mother didn't wait for an introduction or a toast. She marched up to the stage, shoved the confused DJ aside, and snatched the microphone from his hand. A high-pitched, piercing squeal of feedback ripped through the speakers, making every guest in the room flinch and cover their ears. Janet stood under the center spotlight, her face a mask of calculated Southern Belle tragedy. Tonight, the Harper family is in mourning, she screamed into the microphone, her voice amplified until it shook the very foundation of the barn. 150 people froze with their drinks halfway to their lips. She pointed a trembling, red-tipped finger directly at our sweetheart table, her eyes wide with a manic intensity. We have lost a daughter today. We have lost her to a gold digger who only married her to sink his greedy claws into our family home. This man is a thief, and my daughter is a fool for letting him lead her away from her own blood. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a disaster about to strike. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The irony was a jagged blade in my gut. I was the one who had bled $85,000 of my combat pay to keep her roof over her head. And here she was, calling my husband a thief in front of every person I respected. Before the echoes of her voice could even die down, Brielle was on the move. She didn't wait for me to react or for Cole to speak. She marched toward our table, her eyes wide with a predatory, greedy energy. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a stapled document, slamming it down onto the white linen tablecloth right next to my dinner plate. The thwack of the paper echoed in the sudden, horrified quiet of the nearby tables. She pressed a heavy ballpoint pen down on top of it, the click of the pen sounding like a hammer falling on an empty chamber in the silence. "Sign it, Kate," Brielle hissed, her voice low but sharp enough for the surrounding guests to hear every word. "If you have a single shred of conscience left for your parents, you'll sign this gift confirmation letter right now and legally hand over the house. Do it, or this wedding ends in a way you'll never forget." I looked down at the paper, then at the pen, my vision blurring with a mixture of rage and pure, unadulterated heartbreak. My own sister was using my wedding reception as a theater for extortion. I looked at my mother on the stage, still clutching the microphone like a trophy. And my father, who was still hiding behind a glass of punch. They thought they had trapped me. They thought that because I was a good daughter, I would crumble under the weight of public shame and give them exactly what they wanted. I know this is incredibly hard to hear, but I know many of you listening have had your own big day or a moment of joy ruined by someone who just couldn't stand not being the center of attention. If you've ever sat there in total shock while someone who was supposed to love you tried to tear you down in front of the world, please support Kate's journey by hitting the like button right now. I need to know you're standing with me in that hall. Comment the word truth below if you're ready to see what happens when the lies finally stop. Your support is the only thing giving me the strength to finish this. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. They had forgotten that I was a soldier and that Cole was an engineer. We don't surrender when we're ambushed. We counterattack. Cole didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. He slowly pushed his chair back, the wooden legs groaning against the floor like a warning. He stood up, adjusted the buttons on his vest, and looked at Brielle with a terrifying, clinical calm. He didn't even look at the paper she was trying to force on me. Instead, he leaned down, whispered something in my ear that was for me alone, and then began walking. He didn't walk toward the exit. He walked straight toward the technical booth where the projector and the big screen were located. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him reach into his pocket and pull out that small matte black USB drive, the digital bomb we had prepared in the dark of our kitchen. He reached for the control panel, his hand steady, his eyes fixed on the screen that was about to change the history of the Harper family forever. The Harpers wanted a show? Well, the main event was about to begin. Cole's finger hovered over the play button as the screen began to glow with a bright, blinding blue light. The ambush was over. The counteroffensive had just begun. Cole Reston was a man of precise movements and even more precise intentions. He understood a fundamental truth of the battlefield that my family had overlooked. An ambush only works if the target doesn't see the muzzle flash. Janet and Brielle had spent months building a fortress of lies, but they had forgotten that a fortress built on sand cannot withstand a flood of documented reality. The air in the barn was stagnant, a heavy, suffocating silence that made the click hum of the DJ's laptop fan sound like a jet engine in the stillness. Cole didn't hesitate. He stepped into the technical booth, his face a mask of cold, tactical focus. He didn't ask the DJ for permission. He simply disconnected the audio feed and slid the matte black USB drive into the port with a metallic snick that signaled the end of the Harper family's reign of terror. The massive projector screen, usually reserved for sappy slideshows of childhood photos, flickered once and then bathed the entire hall in a harsh, clinical blue light. The first image that burned its way onto the retina of every guest wasn't a wedding portrait. It was a high-resolution, crystal-clear scan of a Chase Bank statement belonging to Staff Sergeant Kate Harper. I watched the guests in the front row, my old neighbors and church elders, lean forward in unison, their eyes widening. At the very center of the page, a single transaction was highlighted in brilliant neon yellow, $85,000. The recipient was Macon Hills Construction and Supply. The date matched exactly with the week the Harper House Foundation had been repaired. My mother stood on the stage, the microphone still clutched in her hand like a scepter. But her face was beginning to crumble. She turned slowly to look at the screen behind her, her pupils dilating as she saw the undeniable proof of where that money had actually come from. 150 people inhaled at the exact same moment. A collective, jagged intake of breath that sounded like a storm breaking. The truth wasn't a whisper in a post office anymore. It was an $85,000 scream that echoed off the cedar rafters and exposed the rot in the room. Cole didn't let the tension dissipate. He clicked the mouse again, and the screen shifted to a rapid-fire collage of scanned invoices and structural reports. Every single document was a nail in the coffin of Brielle's narrative. Line by line, the costs were laid bare for the town to see. Electrical overhauls, copper piping, HVAC systems, and the new roofing shingles. Across every single one of those papers was a bold, digital red stamp that read, "Paid in full by Kate Harper." The silence in the barn finally fractured. It broke into a low, angry murmur that sounded like a hornet's nest being kicked in the middle of a July afternoon. I looked over at my father, Bobby. He was trying to melt into the shadows near the catering tables, his shoulders hunched as he stared at his shoes, his cowardice finally having no place left to hide. But the light found him anyway. One by one, my fellow soldiers and the people of Macon Hills pulled out their phones. The room was suddenly filled with the aggressive, rhythmic click-click of 100 camera shutters and the blinding flashes of mobile lights. The digital footprint was being cemented. The Harper family was being archived in their moment of absolute, irredeemable fraud. Then Cole delivered the killing blow. He looked at me, a silent, tactical confirmation passing between us, and hit the enter key for the final time. The speakers didn't play a song. They played the audio from the FaceTime recording I had captured in the dark of the garage. Brielle's voice, high-pitched and dripping with a terrifying raw greed, filled the barn with a clarity that made my skin crawl. "The old folks are so easy to play," her voice echoed, louder and sharper than the DJ's music had ever been. I just threw them that line about Cole only loving Kate for the house, and they swallowed it whole. Kate is such a fool for dumping $85,000 into a house she's never going to own. As soon as the deed is in my name, I'm flipping it to the developers for $450,000. Easy money. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. A retired first sergeant at the front table stood up so quickly his heavy wooden chair flipped over, crashing against the floorboards with a sound like a gunshot. A glass of champagne shattered near the stage, the liquid splashing against Brielle's black lace dress like a permanent stain of shame. The town of Macon Hills finally saw the golden child for what she really was. A vulture picking at her sister's bones while pretending to be a victim. Cole walked toward the stage with the steady, measured pace of an engineer who had just cleared the final mine. He reached out and calmly pulled the microphone from my mother's frozen, claw-like hand. He didn't even grant her the dignity of a glance. He turned to face the stunned crowd, his voice amplified and steady as a heartbeat. "You were played, Janet," Cole said, his words cutting through the tension like a combat knife. "You were manipulated by your own golden child, while you tried to destroy the only person who actually cared if you had a roof over your head. The show is over." He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the heavy oak doors at the back. "The exit is that way. Get out of my wife's wedding. Now." Brielle didn't try to defend herself. She grabbed her fake Chanel clutch and turned to run, her designer heels clicking frantically and unevenly against the floorboards. She looked like a cornered animal, desperate to escape the 150 cameras documenting her absolute downfall. Bobby grabbed Janet's arm, his face pale as a ghost, and pulled her into the darkness of the parking lot. Their black silhouettes disappeared into the Tennessee night like smoke from a dying fire. The war wasn't just over, it was a total, clinical annihilation. My family had brought a knife to a wedding, but they hadn't realized I had brought the recorded, digital truth. As the projector screen faded back to a soft, neutral blue, the barn erupted. It wasn't the polite sound of a wedding celebration. It was the sound of a community recognizing a survivor. I stood there in my white lace dress, the $85,000 weight finally lifting from my shoulders. I looked at Cole, and for the first time in my 27 years, I didn't care if my mother saw me. I saw myself. And that was more than enough. Mitchell Farrow's office smelled like stale coffee and expensive litigation. I sat across from him, my back as straight as it had been on the parade deck of Fort Campbell. I took my phone out and slid the photograph of Brielle's gift confirmation letter across the heavy mahogany desk. Pharaoh didn't just look at it. He studied it with the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned hunter. He began tapping a heavy fountain pen against the wooden surface, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud echoing in the clinical silence of the room. "They think they were being clever, Kate," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "But by handing you this paper at your wedding, they handed us the heavy rope to hang them with. This isn't just a simple request for a gift. It is a confession that they knew exactly how much money you had invested. It is evidence of their intent to unjustly enrich themselves at your personal expense." I didn't smile. I just watched as he pulled a heavy stack of legal documents from his drawer. The friction of the papers sliding against each other was the only sound in the office. This was the unjust enrichment lawsuit, a legal hammer designed to reclaim what was stolen. Pharaoh slammed a heavy rubber stamp onto the cover page, the sound of the impact vibrating through the table. The subpoena was signed, sealed, and ready to be delivered by a process server to the Harper doorstep before the sun went down. The social fallout in Macon Hills did not take weeks. It took hours. Brielle walked into Gail's Realty on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, her head held high, likely expecting to discuss her $450,000 plan to flip our parents' house. But she didn't even make it past the reception desk. Gail, the owner of the firm, was already standing there with his arms crossed. He had been sitting in the fourth row at my wedding, and he had seen the projector screen flicker to life with the recorded truth. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply pointed to a cardboard box sitting on the sidewalk outside the glass front doors. "Our business is built on trust and community reputation, Brielle," Gail said, his voice loud enough for every other agent in the room to hear clearly. "I cannot have someone in this office who calculates the price of her own parents' home while her sister is off fighting wars. You are finished here." He watched as she walked out, her face a mask of humiliated fury. Within the hour, Travis, the man who was supposed to be her partner in this heist, had blocked her number. He didn't want the house, he wanted the commission. When the $450,000 vanished into thin air, he vanished right along with it, leaving her to face the town's judgment alone. Sunday morning at the Baptist church used to be Janet's theater. She was the head of the charity committee, the woman who sat in the front row and dictated the social standing of every family in town. But that Sunday, the theater was empty. When she tried to walk down the center aisle, the rows of women who used to hang on her every word suddenly found their hymnals very interesting. The whispering started the moment she stepped through the door, a low, buzzing sound like 1,000 angry wasps. By the time the service was over, the deacons had politely informed her that her position on the committee was no longer required. She was forced to leave through the side exit, her head bowed low, avoiding the glares of the people she had lied to for months. Back at the house, my father, Bobby, took his usual cowardly path. He spent the entire day in the garage, the engine of his lawnmower roaring as he went over the same patch of grass again and again. He didn't want to hear the phone ring. He didn't want to hear the doorbell. He was trapped in the very box of silence and abuse he had helped build, unable to look at the wreckage of the family he had failed to lead. 6 weeks later, the war moved from the church pews to a cold conference room. Under the looming threat of an asset freeze and a full public deposition, the Harpers finally surrendered. There was no more screaming, no more gold digger accusations. There was only the sound of high-end pens scratching against legal parchment. Mitchell Pharaoh had them trapped. The settlement was absolute. They were legally ordered to repay the entire $85,000, every single penny, in monthly installments over the next 36 months. But the real victory was the lien. I forced them to sign a document that placed a legal encumbrance on the title of the house. I didn't want the building, and I didn't want to live in their rot. But I wanted them to know that I owned the ground they walked on. Every time they looked at those walls, they would remember that they were paying me back for the blood I had spilled to keep them dry. I watched my mother's hand shake as she signed her name at the bottom of the last page. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was a debtor. I walked out of that office into the bright Tennessee sun, the weight of a decade's worth of betrayal finally lifting. I was no longer the girl seeking their approval. I was the woman who had demanded her truth back, and I had gotten it with interest. The heat of early August in Tennessee is a heavy, suffocating weight that usually clings to the skin like a wet blanket, but for the first time in 27 years, it didn't feel like it was trying to drown me. I stood by the window of our small rental house on the outskirts of town, watching Cole out in the yard. The rhythmic, honest sound of his hammer driving nails into the cedar framing of our new home was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of a foundation built on truth, not the rotting timber and hollow promises of the house in Macon Hills. Cole wasn't just building walls. He was constructing a perimeter between me and a past that had almost buried me alive. Between us, there was finally a silence that didn't feel like a weapon. In the middle of that same week, the golden child finally finished her work. Brielle didn't leave with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful apology. She left in the middle of a Tuesday night, driven by the same cold, predatory instinct she had used to try and steal my $85,000. She didn't just walk away, she cleaned them out. She raided the emergency kitchen drawer, cupping the $3,000 in cash my parents had hidden away for a rainy day. Then, she grabbed the spare keys from the hook and stole my father's silver SUV. The tires let out a sharp, jagged squeal against the asphalt as she sped toward the state line, leaving two elderly people in a silent house with a 36-month legal debt they had no way of paying. She was as ruthless in her abandonment as she had been in her greed. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat. They had sacrificed me for her, and in return, she had gutted them. Then the phone rang. I looked down at the screen, and for a second, my heart skipped a beat. It was my father. Bobby hadn't called me first in over 10 years. I used to pray for this call, imagining a world where he would tell me he loved me or that he was proud of my service. I picked it up, but the man on the other end wasn't the father I remembered. His voice was a thin, shattered rasp, trembling with the kind of terror only felt by someone who has realized they are completely alone. "Kate, please." "Brielle is gone," he stammered, the sound of his breathing heavy and desperate through the static of the line. "She took everything. The cash, the car, everything. We don't know how to make the installment for the lawyer this month. We made a mistake, Kate. We were wrong about everything." I stood there, my hand tightening around the cool glass of my phone. I looked out at Cole, who was pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, his eyes finding mine through the glass and offering a small, knowing nod. I realized then that my father wasn't crying because he missed me. He wasn't apologizing because he realized he had spent a decade treating me like a bank account. He was crying because his favored daughter had left him with the bill. He was apologizing because the well had finally run dry, and he had nowhere else to turn for a rescue. The mistake they made wasn't hurting me. It was trusting a vulture they had raised themselves. "If your car is missing, Dad, you need to call the police and file a formal report," I said, my voice coming out slow and clinical, devoid of the old fire and the familiar hurt. "And if you can't make the payment, you need to call the bank or Mitchell Farrow's office. They handle the legal schedule now. I have no control over the court's decision." "Kate, please," he whimpered, a sound so pathetic it made my stomach turn. "We're your family. We're all we have left. You can't just leave your mother and me like this. We're old, Kate. We're losing the house." "I'm not a firefighter anymore, Dad," I replied, the words feeling like a heavy stone finally settling into place. "I spent 10 years putting out the fires Brielle started while you and Mom held the matches, and watched me burn. I'm out of water. I'm out of empathy. Good luck." I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't wait to hear the sob that was building in his throat or the excuses he would try to pile on top of his guilt. I simply pressed the red button. The screen went black, and I felt a physical sensation of a weight being lifted off my chest, a release of tension I didn't know I was still carrying. I opened my contacts, scrolled down to the name, Dad, and hit delete. Then I did the same for my mother. I blocked their social media accounts, blocked their emails, and sent a final text to Mitchell Farrow, instructing him that any further communication from the Harpers must be handled strictly through the United States Postal Service. I didn't cry. There was no grief left in me, only a cold, quiet peace. They had once kicked me out of my lavender-painted bedroom to make room for their favorite child, and now I was sealing the door to my entire life so they could never walk through it again. I walked out the back door and into the Tennessee sun, the dry grass crunching under my boots. The house in Macon Hills was silent now, a large empty box filled with two people who had finally realized that when you bet everything on a lie, you eventually end up with nothing. I wasn't the glass child anymore. I was the architect of my own freedom. As I walked toward Cole, the sound of the world felt different, sharper, clearer, and finally, my own. I reached the foundation of our new home, stepped over the threshold, and didn't look back once. The door was closed. The war was over. By the end of October, the thick, suffocating humidity of the Tennessee summer had finally surrendered to a crisp, biting autumn wind. Cole and I had found a small, neglected log cabin on the far outskirts of the county, a place where the grass grew waist-high and the floorboards groaned under every step like they were whispering old secrets. This time, there were no handshakes on a porch and no verbal promises made over coffee. Every single document, every deed, and every cent spent was split 50-50, signed in bold black ink and stamped by a state-certified notary. We weren't just buying a piece of property, we were establishing a forward operating base where the rules of engagement were clearly defined and legally binding. Using Cole's combat engineer skills and my own stubborn discipline, we spent our weekends stripping away layers of water-damaged drywall and pouring fresh cement into the cracks of the foundation. We weren't waiting for a family blessing or a mother's approval to feel at home. We were building it ourselves, one honest swing of the hammer at a time. The sound of the power drill echoing through the empty rooms wasn't just noise, it was the healthy, vibrant heartbeat of a life that finally belonged to us. On the morning of my 28th birthday, a single, small white envelope appeared in our new mailbox. I recognized the shaky, cramped handwriting immediately. It was my father. There was no thick stack of cash inside, no long-winded apology for the $85,000 they had tried to steal, and no explanation for a decade of silence. There was only a simple card with 4 words written in the center. "Happy birthday, Kate. Love, Dad." I carried the envelope into our kitchen, the smell of fresh pine shavings and sawdust still lingering in the air. I walked over to our new, industrial-grade stainless steel refrigerator, the kind that didn't have a single scratch or a dent. I grabbed a small, heavy magnet and pinned the card right in the center of the door. I stood back and looked at it. For the first time in my life, there were no professional headshots of Brielle or hollow social announcements for the golden child to block it. This card sat in the open, unburdened, and visible. I hadn't forgiven him, and I certainly hadn't forgotten the way he hid in the garage while my mother tried to ruin my wedding. But I had stopped carrying the weight of his cowardice. The anger that had fueled me for years had finally cooled into something steady and manageable. I didn't need their redemption to be whole. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange, I stood in the kitchen with 2 cold beers. I pushed one toward Cole, who was covered in a fine layer of dust and paint. We stood there in the quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant call of a hawk. I had spent 10 years in the Army, surviving mortar fire in the desert and the raw, bloody chaos of a trauma bay. I had faced the worst of humanity across the ocean and never once felt like I would break. But it was the betrayal of my own blood, the people who were supposed to be my primary defense, that had nearly taken me down. Standing there in my own kitchen, I finally grasped a bloody, hard-earned truth. Love and trust are not the same thing. Love is an involuntary emotion, a pull of the heart that we often can't control, even when it's directed at people who don't deserve it. But trust is a contract. It is a high-stakes agreement that must be earned, signed in action, and maintained with absolute transparency. To give trust without a contract isn't love. It's a tactical error that leads to total annihilation. I realized then that loving someone doesn't mean giving them a blank check signed with your dignity. You have every right to love a person and still tell them a loud, echoing no when they try to cross your perimeter. Setting a boundary isn't an act of selfishness or a betrayal of your heritage. It is an act of survival. The ultimate betrayal is when you stand down, Lower your weapons and allow the people who should be protecting you to trample over your worth because you're afraid of the silence that comes with saying goodbye. A boundary isn't a wall designed to keep the world out in a state of permanent isolation. A boundary is a sentry gate. It is the checkpoint where you decide who is qualified to enter the sovereign territory of your life. I looked at the door of our cabin, solid and locked, and I felt a sense of power that no rank or medal had ever given me. From this moment on, I was the only person with the keys to the gate. I was the one who decided who was a guest and who was a threat. The war for my soul was finally over, and for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't just a soldier following orders. I was the commander of my own peace. I took a long, cold sip of my beer, looked at the man who had stood by me when the world went black, and smiled. The house was finished, the truth was out, and the door was closed. Kate's journey serves as a powerful testament to the necessity of personal sovereignty in the modern world. It teaches us that while love may be an inherent bond of the heart, trust is a professional-grade contract that must be earned through consistent respect and transparency. The most vital lesson here is that setting a perimeter around your peace is not an act of betrayal against your family. It is an act of loyalty to yourself. True healing does not depend on an apology that may never come. Instead, it begins the moment you reclaim the keys to your own life and realize that you are the only one authorized to decide who is worthy of entering your gate. If Kate's courage in standing up to the vultures in her life resonated with you today, you are certainly not alone. Many of us have faced that impossible choice between a toxic bloodline and our own survival. Did you feel that same rush of justice when the truth finally hit the screen in that barn? We want to hear from you. If you believe that respect is the true foundation of any family, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of survivors and truth seekers. Leave a comment with the word sovereign below to let us know that you too are the commander of your own story. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful truths.